So the title of my remarks today is The Missionary Theory of Industrial Policy. And the theme really addresses what I think is been quite a significant sort of cultural economic shift in a number of Western liberal democracies that's actually been happening maybe for 10 years, maybe 15 years. Ones that we saw particularly evident in the pandemic, but I think the actual underlying ideas or themes predate the pandemic. What we saw during the pandemic, and I think also beforehand, was an increasing belief that in order to deal with a highly uncertain world, governments need to be taking big and bold measures to bring about additional levels of confidence for their populations. Now, we see this in situations like the pandemic, where it's believed that only government can bring about some kind of order in what is an emergency situation. But we also see it in the support in many countries for Green New Deals or bold proposals to tackle social and economic inequality. There's the idea that large-scale government action, what we might refer to as missionary government action, is a fundamental part of a contemporary economic order, that regimes that exhibit these kind of missionary policies have various beneficial qualities. Now, I want to argue in the presentation that we saw this missionary government through the pandemic, and the experience of that missionary government reveals not only the economic perils that we can associate with this kind of missionary regime, but also the profound threats to individual freedom that this kind of idea generates. And that's going to be the theme of the presentation. So I'm going to divide my remarks into 4 parts. I'm going to start off by outlining basically the theoretical arguments for adopting what we might refer to as the missionary position. In the second part of the presentation, I'm going to go through some of the theoretical and practical problems that we may think could be associated with the adoption of this particular posture. In the third part of my remarks, I'll illustrate those problems in the context of the response to the pandemic. And then in the fourth and final part of my presentation, I'll illustrate how I believe these kind of pathologies are likely to play out in the context of many of the other missions that are currently being proposed in contemporary liberal political economies, if that's the right term to use. So first of all, what is mission-oriented government? What does it mean to adopt the missionary position, and who actually advocate for this kind of a view? Well, without wanting to single her out, I think you should look no further than the work of Mariana Mazzucato as one of the major inspirations for this kind of notion. So Mazzucato and a lot of people who are her followers in public policy circles argue that the relative economic stagnation that's been experienced in many Western liberal economies in the last 20 years or so reflects a lack of what they refer to as mission commitment. And they associate this lack of mission commitment with the dominance of what they see as so-called neoliberal ideas about the role of markets within society. Now, what they describe as neoliberalism is not a totally anti-interventionist position, but it is a position that basically sees the market system overall as being fundamentally sound and only requiring technical fixes in individual markets where there are particular problems to do with externalities, public goods problems, this sort of a thing. So you basically have a view that the market functions relatively well, but there are some technical fixes that can be applied in specific locales within the market system. So this is, if you like, mission-less government or piecemeal interventionism at most. Now, it seems to me that's actually a reasonably accurate characterization of what a broadly classical liberal view of a market model would be, that you don't have missionary government. But on the view of people like Mazzucato, the lack of mission is actually what is responsible for relative economic stagnation. So what is the argument that underlies this kind of a claim? Well, it's essentially an argument about uncertainty. It's the idea that if you just leave things to the market, if you don't try to lead the market in some sense, then agents, market actors, entrepreneurs, businesses, other actors, they're basically operating in a kind of atomistic kind of situation where the kind of uncertainty they face sort of leads to a state of paralysis. So if you've got to cope with a radically uncertain world where you don't know what other actors in the society are actually going to be doing, you won't actually have the confidence to act. So what we have here is a claim that in order for people to have the confidence to act, someone needs to provide some kind of vision around which people can coordinate. Now, this isn't an argument for eradicating entrepreneurship per se. It's the claim that in order to generate the benefits of entrepreneurship, somebody needs to provide some baseline level of certainty, which generates the kind of context within which entrepreneurial action can take place. Without this kind of vision, you just have short-termism, you have a lack of confidence for the actors involved. Now, what this means in practice is the suggestion that we should have big and bold public investment schemes to generate environments within which market confidence can be generated. So Mazzucato is a big supporter of the Green New Deal. She is a big supporter of industrial policy. The idea is that large-scale public spending organized around what she considers to be essential common goods can actually provide entrepreneurs with the certainty that they need to start to engage in more enterprising actions. So on this kind of a view, you shouldn't leave it to the market, you should lead the market. In order for the market to operate effectively, someone needs to be providing this kind of background certainty. And that can only come, Mazzucato argues, from these kind of visionary government actions. Now, I should say, there's actually nothing new about this kind of idea. Nothing new about this idea at all. You can trace it back to John Maynard Keynes and his case for what he described in the general theory as a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment. So what was Keynes's argument in that book? Well, Keynes was concerned about the animal spirits of capitalism, entrepreneurial dynamism, actually being disabled by the inherent unpredictability of the future. The fact that entrepreneurs are operating in a world where they don't know what the future holds. They've no idea. They're operating in a world of what many people in the Austrian tradition would refer to as radical uncertainty. Okay, there are unknown unknowns. On the Keynesian view, or the view that Keynes himself put forward, it's precisely this radical uncertainty that disables entrepreneurship. So someone in these situations needs to come forward to provide some kind of vision in this otherwise meaningless abyss around which people can coordinate. This is the argument. Now, Mazzucato basically takes that argument forward today, saying that we need visionary government action in areas like environmental policy, addressing climate change, various social, economic inequalities, to provide this kind of setting where people have the confidence to move forward in what would otherwise be a disabling environment of extreme uncertainty. So that, in a nutshell, is the missionary position We need missions. We need the state to lead, to have a vision in order for entrepreneurship to be facilitated. It's important to emphasize that people like Mazzucato are not claiming to be anti-capitalist. Okay, now you could wonder whether underneath the surface of this there is a certain anti-capitalism, but she claims not to be anti-capitalist. She claims to be pro-capitalist. She claims to have a proper theoretical understanding of the background requirements for entrepreneurship to actually take place. And that's also arguably the view that Keynes put forward. Now, what are the problems with this position, this missionary position? Well, there are three sorts of problems that I want to focus on. And I'll run these problems through later on in the talk through both the experience of the pandemic and some of the specific policies that people like Mazzucato are proposing. The first problem really relates to what I think is one of Hayek's most profound papers. It's not the paper on the use of knowledge in society. He has a paper called The Theory of Complex Phenomena. And in that paper, the essential argument is, I'm just paraphrasing here, there are certain kinds of uncertainty that cannot be eradicated because of the very nature of the human condition. Essentially, unless you're able to read other people's minds and control other people's minds, you cannot have the kind of certainty that the missionary position promises to people. Now, there are a number of reasons that we can point to for that. First of all, the people who are in charge of developing the missions don't know how people are going to react to them. You don't know how people will react to the mission that you put forward. That's point number one. Second, how do the people who choose the mission, who put forward the mission, know that they've chosen the right one? There are many different missions or visions that you could put forward. How do you know what the right mission is? All missions, if we use economists' language, have an opportunity cost. What are the missions that you could have had if you didn't actually pursue the mission that you've chosen? Opportunity costs are fundamental. They cannot just be eradicated by saying, well, we're going to do one particular vision or theme. Competition between ideas, which people like Mazzucato in many ways seem to see as somehow generating uncertainty, is not problematic on the Hayekian type view. It's actually through competition between missions that we actually learn something about the world. Not a claim that we have certain knowledge, or full knowledge of anything, but that we have any knowledge at all comes about because there is contestation between ideas, that there isn't any one missionary view that is actually put forward. If you try to eradicate competition within an economic system, then all you're left with in terms of any kind of mechanism for learning is to look at other societies. So if you have a missionary position adopted within the UK, for example, the only way you can have any kind of learning or reflexivity about that mission is to look at the missions that are being pursued in France or Germany or wherever else. But that's not the same kind of dynamic feedback that you get in a context where, say, firms within a market are competing against one another, and where we've got profit and loss signals actually indicating whose views are proving more or less successful in a highly uncertain world. There's a second, though, and related problem with this missionary sort of a view. Remember that the claim of people who put forward this kind of argument is that diversity, if you like, the fact that we live in a world where there are all these many different ideas, is the problem. Now, if you take that view, that means that you're going to be very harsh, to put it mildly, on people who are critical of your mission. If the mission is going to have these supposed effects where you give people confidence to follow the mission, that means you've got to be single-minded and determined to stick with the mission. Okay, you've got to resist criticism. You've got to say, this is my vision. This is what I want to do. We are going to proceed effectively come what may. Because if you don't do that, if you don't have that single-minded determination, then people are going to start to recognize again, well, we are in an uncertain world. How do we know if this mission is the right one or the wrong one? Third, and related point, this kind of idea of having a mission leads almost inevitably to the suppression of dissent. Because if you allow dissenting missions to have the light of day, then the problem of uncertainty returns. Okay? People will start to doubt the mission. So in order to keep the mission, you must suppress dissent. You must limit the possibility for alternative conceptions of the world, alternative understandings to come to the surface. What this means is that, in effect, you have to sustain almost wartime conditions in your political economy. You have to have a situation where people are devoted to the mission and where those who challenge it are treated as the equivalent of kind of traitors in some sense, or moral deviants. Now, there's a quotation I have from Walter Lippmann, which I think illustrates this kind of argument very well. This is from 1936, and this is what Lippmann says. The war spirit identifies dissent with treason, the pursuit of private happiness with slackerism and sabotage, and on the other side, obedience with discipline, conformity with patriotism. Thus, at one stroke, war extinguishes the difficulty of planning, cutting out any moral ground on which he might resist the execution of the official plan. This is the kind of environment, the kind of atmosphere that is required to sustain missionary government. Now, what I want to argue next is that the three features that I've just identified, the problem of complexity, not knowing enough about the world in situations where you extinguish competition, the problem of single-minded commitment to a plan, and the problem of the suppression of dissent were all evident in the response that we saw to the coronavirus pandemic. And they are all evident, albeit to a lesser degree, in some of the attempts we are seeing now to move forward with missionary theories of government. So let me start off by looking at the pandemic response as an example of this kind of process. Now, the first thing to say here is, if ever there's going to be a situation where you want missionary government, something like a pandemic is probably the situation where you would want to have it. Okay, so you could make an argument, I'm not saying this argument is correct, but you could make an argument that an emergency situation like a pandemic is the type of situation where you want missionary government. You don't want a situation where you'd be akin to a situation on a battlefield where there are multiple deliberations going on about what tactics should be. You actually need a strong leader in these situations to say, this is what we're going to do. Okay, you can't have competition between particular sorts of vision on a military battlefield. Likewise, you could make the argument that in a situation of emergency such as a pandemic, you might need some kind of strong leadership. So that's the first sort of context framing that I want to put forward there. But nonetheless, many of the problems that we might expect from this missionary position as I've outlined it, we could still expect might arise in these kind of emergency response situations. And I think we can see this in the context of what happened with the coronavirus pandemic. So the first problem that we have, which is an uncertainty problem, is, well, what should the right mission have been in the context of the pandemic? You know, should we have had lockdown measures, or should we have had some other kind of missionary policy to try to cope with the pandemic itself? Should the focus of the pandemic response have been on the actual health outcomes that arise from adopting a particular policy, or should we have been paying more attention to the economic consequences, both of the pandemic and of the actual response to it? Okay? These are, in a complex situation, problems that no one may necessarily have the answer to. It may not be obvious what the answer to those questions actually is or should have been. Now, we're a couple of years out from when the pandemic ended, but it strikes me that even today, no one can tell you what the right response should have been. Okay? So I'm someone who is pretty agnostic actually about what should have happened in the pandemic. Seems to me not unreasonable that governments experimented with lockdowns, but today, if you look at the evidence, you have a variety of different countries with different institutions, different cultures, different policy responses, all of which produced a mixture of good and bad results. You cannot look at the different policies that were implemented and say, this was the right model to pursue. It's simply unknown what concatenation of factors were required to produce an acceptable result, even if today we're actually capable of identifying what an acceptable result would have looked like. So here we have a situation where missionary action does not create some kind of certainty about the world or confidence for people. It actually just leaves us in the situation that we were in anyway, where we don't know what the right action should have been. The second thing that strikes me or struck me about the response to the pandemic was that in many different countries, but perhaps especially in those that pursued the lockdown type policies, we saw a tendency for public health bureaucrats and for politicians to refuse to change course. Once the mission had been decided upon, once they decided to have lockdowns or some other policy, they would not accept criticism of those policy measures. The sense was that once we've started on this course, we must pursue it. Okay, now this is the second point I mentioned about the character of these missionary regimes. You define the mission and then you must stick with it, come what may. Otherwise, people will start to lose confidence in it. Third, and relatedly, what we also saw in the context of the pandemic response was a suppression of dissent. It's not only that public health bureaucrats and politicians didn't want to engage in some kind of reflexivity or change of course, at least not publicly. It's also that they consciously sought to suppress and to demonize people who were opposing the policies that they were putting forward, much as you do as the kind of situation you have in wartime. Okay, it was very much that kind of war spirit where you're either with us or you're against us. That was the kind of atmosphere. Now, maybe it was necessary in these kind of circumstances, okay? But I'm simply pointing out that suppression of dissent was fundamental to these kind of measures. It's important to recognize as well that that suppression of dissent and the demonization wasn't just applied to individuals. It was even applied to jurisdictions that didn't go along with what was perceived to be the right narrative. So if you look at the way that countries like Sweden were treated in the UK and US media, or jurisdictions like Florida were treated, irrespective of whether these policies were right or wrong, if you look at the way they were treated, you have this suppression of dissent, this demonization of the other, people who are doing things differently, taking place, very much in the kind of spirit that Walter Lippmann was referring to. You're either with us or you're against us. This is the kind of atmosphere that pervades in these circumstances. So those are how this missionary position played out in the context of the pandemic. But I think we've got good reason to believe that these very same traits would be evidenced were this kind of missionary theory of government to be applied on a wider remit. Okay, were we to extend it not just to what might be considered emergency situations, but were this to become a kind of norm of what government should be doing. And that, remember, is precisely what people like Mariana Mazzucato are arguing for. They want this kind of missionary zeal to be the norm, not just something that you have in emergency. They want it to be a permanent aspect of the political economic framework. So what I want to suggest is that the kind of problems that we saw in the pandemic, from an economic point of view and from this kind of suppression of freedom point of view, would be played out simply over a longer time scale if we adopted the Mazzucato-style policies. Now, what evidence do we have for that? Well, I think we've got evidence on the 3 points that I made in my kind of theoretical critique of these sorts of ideas. We have evidence that the kind of missionary government or missionary industrial policy that Mazzucato supports doesn't necessarily produce the outcomes that it claims to do, or at least there is radical uncertainty about whether these missions achieve what they do. Second, we have evidence that people who pursue these kind of policies, or governments that pursue these kind of policies, are semi-authoritarian or disciplinary in character. And third, related to that, these kind of policies tend to go hand in hand with a systematic suppression of dissent. Let me work through those 3 stages of the argument in the context of these policies. First,
I don't want to.
Yeah.
Just a few. If
Yeah.
Think about
So,
sort of.
yeah. Okay. So, yeah, we'll do. It was half an hour. Is that's what I was? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No worries. Yeah. Okay. So let me just quickly go through the argument. There's no systematic evidence that the kind of industrial policies that people like Mazzucato support are necessary for economic growth or to avoid stagnation. So to give one example, Joel Mokyr points out that the Industrial Revolution in the UK took place in a context where the state was spending around about 5% of GDP. 5%. We know also that we've got many examples of industrial policies or missionary policies that have manifestly failed. Look at post-independence India up to 1991. Look at most of post-colonial Africa. These are all failures. Equally though, and this is an important point to recognize, there are some examples of what look like successes of industrial policy. So you can point to China as saying, this is an interventionist regime, it has various missions, and you could say to a certain extent, it's worked. You might also point to Singapore as an example of a country that has a kind of interventionist apparatus on some dimensions and where the policy has worked. You might also do what Mariana Mazzucato does and point to the United States, the military-industrial complex, huge amounts of public spending which she claims have triggered various sorts of benefits as evidence that the policy has worked. Now, I don't think a sophisticated classical liberal response to these examples of policy working needs to deny the possibility that these policies could have worked. What it would do, though, is to say there's no evidence that what Mazzucato refers to as a directional intelligence is responsible for these outcomes. In the Chinese case, it's not clear whether it was the policy that worked, the industrial policy, or the removal of controls in other sorts of areas. In the Singaporean case, it's not clear whether it was the industrial policy that produced the beneficial outcomes, or whether it's actually the fact they have an environment that's very attractive to foreign direct investment, that is responsible for the outcomes. There's no systematic mechanism to actually pick which of these policies will operate in a particular situation and deliver beneficial results. In effect, you can say whether or not industrial policy works is down to accident, a particular concatenation of events that may produce a beneficial outcome, much in the way that certain pandemic policies may have turned out to work, not because of the power of some directional intelligence, but essentially out of a kind of accident in certain circumstances. Now, further evidence of that, you can actually look at the experience of China. There's a great book called Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics by a guy called Yasheng Huang. And he locates two different phases in the Chinese experience. The period between 1976 and 1989, where there was a liberalization of trade, and the period after that, when there was a more industrial-oriented policy approach. He notices no difference in growth rates between those periods. Significantly, though, the second period was associated with a deliberate governmental attempt to suppress dissent. The industrial policy was introduced partly to deal with the consequences of the previous economic liberalization. The fact that we had the 1989 uprising, we had a change in economic policy to effectively crush that dissent by concentrated economic development in special zones that the Chinese state could actually try to control. Relatedly, if you look at the example of the military-industrial complex in the United States, okay, which Mazzucato claims have had these beneficial properties, this isn't exactly in an environment where we have open debate, pluralism, and freedom operating. This is the ultimate example of a closed, secretive, disciplinary type of regime. Okay? This is another example of how the kind of policy environment, not only is it not clear whether or not it has beneficial effects or not, but what is clear is that it's a kind of regime that suppresses pluralism. It minimizes dissent. And this, it strikes me, is the most disturbing aspect of these kind of policies, the suppression of dissent. And we are seeing it today in so-called liberal political economies. If you think about what is happening in terms of policies like net zero or the Green New Deal, these are all policy areas where there is a mission commitment from the state, and woe betide those who do not get along with the mission. Woe betide you if you're an academic looking for research funding that doesn't go along with this particular mission. Woe betide if you're a corporation that doesn't go along with this particular mission. Woe betide anyone who is seen to be a traitor or a dissident in the context of the mission that's being put forward. In the context of these policies, I submit, not only will there be no evidence or no systematic evidence that governments are able to pick the right kind of policies. We've got good theoretical reasons to believe that governments don't pick winners, or if they do pick them, they don't actually understand the reasons why they pick them. But worse than that, we've got every reason to believe from the evidence that wherever these kind of policies are pursued, they go hand in hand with the suppression of individual freedom. That, to me, is perhaps the primary reason why liberals of all parties should reject them. Thank you very much.